Now, of course, the figure. Figure is something that we've used since pretty much the beginning of humans. If we look at the reasons why we may have used the figure to say something, could be ritual, could be spiritual. The representation and use of the figure is rooted throughout the history of humans, from the early fertility goddess figures to today. And if you look at anatomy, um, Gray's Anatomy is a good one to search online, not the TV show, but the book that doctors use. You can understand anatomy a lot more now. We know from the past that artists studied corpses and other sources to see the muscle structure. So, different ways to approach it, you know. But I think the best thing to think about with the figure is to think about that it's used in virtually every media. Here's a me underneath a Maori doorway in New Zealand, and the way the wood is carved is something you could be influenced by. Of course, there's appropriation issues if you start taking things from other cultures, but there's no reason why you can't be influenced by things in traditions from other cultures. So here's a John Buck, a contemporary artist who uses the figure quite extensively. This is a wood, all carved wood pieces. Sometimes it's mixed with sound, like Nick Cave's sound suits, and you think about the figure as a performative direction too. Robert Brady does a lot of clay and a lot of wood, so he encompasses a variety of media in his work. And in photography and digital art, the figure has been used quite extensively also. Here's a large performance piece with actual bodies, and that's just the eye to a head. Ron Mueck is a figurative artist who works primarily with um, resins, but starts out in clay quite often and makes molds of them. You can see from the scale of the first one and this one that Ron Mueck has this um, hyper-realism direction going. Jamie, as you see from this one, you see him working on the clay in the top right. He often starts off with maquettes, and Jamie Sullivan then expands it to that larger scale, all the time using clay as the main material before he makes the mold. So you can see the mold process here. And then he pulls a resin from it. But of course, the details that you can get from clay on any scale, from large to small, are a really great place to start. Sometimes that's the end result, that clay is what you use for the piece. This is a Beth Strichter, and this is Tip Tolan. They did a workshop together once, and then here's an image of her using clay. I'll show some of her work more at the end here. And of course, the clay has been used as a utilitarian media for a long time. So you think of the figure in the painterly aspect of the figure has been used on clay quite extensively also. The mochi are from Peru. They were around, they predate the Incas, and they were around quite a bit longer than the Incas were, but you can even see that they use clay as a mold. So this is a bisque mold for a bottle. These are called stirrup vessels. And they had very, abstract, childish to very naturalistic work in their culture. We look at the Han Dynasty or the Tang Dynasty. In China, you see it throughout all dynasties in China. You see the figure being used. The terracotta warriors are a really good example. I'll show that later. Throughout the Xia Dynasty and Goryeo dynasty in Iran, in Korea, and then in Iran, you see the figure, Peru, everywhere you go. Okay. Here's a large clay doorway piece. This is Della Robbia. Again, this is the terracotta warriors, and they unearthed these within my lifetime, and you see there's thousands of clay figures in there. Something really to investigate it. In the contemporary sense, again, the figure is used, like Akio Takamori would paint it on the surface, and also use the figure to create the pieces. Andrea Gill, same kind of idea. I love how Cindy has this waistline happening here. Kind of reiterates the figure. Any of these going too fast for you, you can just think about writing their names down. You can watch this and take down Adrienne Arleo and do more research on her to see what her work is about. You can find out more conceptually on why John DeFazio uses the figure or Mark Burns does, but you can also look at their work on a more extensive level. Kurt Weiser quite often does China painting on the surface of utilitarian objects. Sergei Yusupov is one of my favorite figurative artists. He's from Estonia originally and lives in Massachusetts. And these are actually teapots. Quite often, I'll be showing you some older work of people because this is a more dated collection of images of Sergei. His newer work is all larger than life, and you might want to investigate his work further. Again, as you see the dates, like here's from 1988, this is Richard Naken. So the idea of elements within the figure, whether they be organs like this heart, there's different ways to really think about how you're looking at what figurative art really means. David Regan, how this snake has swallowed a human, or this fawn is giving birth. These are both soup tureens. Again, like kind of going back and forth, looking at historical work that is still being done within a traditional context. This is actually Xu Tang from China. He lives in Dingshan or Dingshu near Yixing. And he's a real famous teapot maker, but he does a lot of figures, of course, based around Buddha. And these are all basic, different Buddhas. This is like one of my students who came with me to China last time I went. You can see, again, the scale of these. So tile work is often used to express the figure in clay, too. Again, you see a lot of Picasso stuff. He actually did more stuff in clay than he did paintings, assemblages, all put together. He did a lot of clay work. This is a Mark Burns again, kind of along that idea of tile, but more in a three-dimensional format, like billboards. This is Stan Welsh, where he's incorporated photography into the piece. This is Richard Shaw, amazing trompe-l'oeil artist, who often would work with the figure but use trompe-l'oeil elements that he's made out of clay, even those pencils in the hand. I believe this piece is about 4 feet tall, so scale is something to think about. The idea around surrealism comes in a lot. Look at her ponytail turning into a snake. Showed some Adrienne Arleo. I'll bring that up again, like that idea of yoga poses and morphing. This figure has wings, but also has bird feet, as this one has a dog coming out. Here's some more Akio and Akio at work. Akio was one of my favorite artists in the ceramic world, and he did quite a bit of really great figures at the end of his life. Um, you can see the big, huge figurative piece at the Whole Foods in Seattle. That's his. Some more Akios, uh, later work. And here's, again, this is his earlier work. All porcelain. This is some of Akio's later work where he would take a whole room, recreate a village or a scene. There's a lot of funk artists like Alan Rosenbaum who used the figure in a variety of different ways. These are all low fire. Again, researching these artists will let you understand what temperature range they were at and a variety of building techniques they may have employed. This is Doug Jeck. He's a professor over at the UW in Seattle. And a lot of mixed media worked in. That's actually hair on the Christ figure. That is a wooden ladder upside down. That's actually rope, and I think it's a bronze hand, and then there's actual hair embedded for the chest hair and the hair on the eyebrows and the head. Christina West, playing with color fields and different patterning on the surface. Again, scale relevant to if you're coil building it. Obviously, the coils are a lot bigger than a 1/4 inch. So when we get into talking about technical directions on how to make your pieces, whether they be solid or hollow, you bring that up depending on the scale. You think about thickness. I think head studies are a great place to start, which is why we're starting with a head study. This is Arthur Gonzalez, Lars Calamar. I re-show Mark Burns' work a lot because I think he had a lot of humor going on in his work and real pointed. You can kind of see a scale shot here with one of his pieces. Song Koo, having him in a scale shot gives you the sense of, whatever scale you want to work, depending on your kiln, of course, and your abilities. In this particular course, we're limited to scale for a variety of reasons. But you aren't limited as you start to get advanced and you start thinking about things. See how large his kiln is there. It's bigger than our car kiln, but you can imagine making things in pieces too that would stack. Quite a different studio. So as you get into different studios, it does make a difference on what you could possibly achieve. Joe Bova, working with animal imagery along with the figure. Dirk Stashke, looking at how, like, his new work has really no figurative directions, but as you see in this piece, he started to get somewhat hyper realistic with his work, and you could see a lot of real hyper realism in his new work. Again, Richard Shaw, one of the cutting edge trompe l'oeil artists. Jack Earl quite extensively would make large stories around his pieces, and his titles would sometimes be 3 or 4 paragraphs long. The woman with the dog here, that's about a 4-foot tall piece, and then on the other side, there's a different sculpted image. And he also made with really small figurative pieces, these four gentlemen on the left top are actually 12 to 13 inches in height. So the figure gets personal sometimes. Jan Holcomb was dealing with MS, and a lot of Jan's work was um, kind of talking about that. James Tanner, Don Wrights, those are John Woodard. You see like the way the surface has been treated as a painting. Joseph Siegenthaler. Joseph Siegenthaler got his start in a wax museum, and his surfaces and his work is really amazing to see in person. It's very trompe l'oeil in the way it's fooling the eye. You kind of come around the corner, and this hyper realism direction kind of hits you, but then you see some of the humor or qualities in it. You kind of know it's not real, but it's kind of scary. Liz King's work is somewhat like that. If you look at this part here, and if you just look at close-ups, it's hard to believe that it's porcelain. But then she carves pear wood and does these other elements in her pieces that make you understand that it is something other than a person. Here's some more of Liz King's work, just close-ups. Part of her work has to do with film, and so a lot of these you can find moving. She'll make them move and sort of animate them. This is her studio on the left. Judy Manellis. I haven't seen any of her new work recently, but she used to be one of my favorite figurative artists. I know they abstract it more. June Kanenko or Ruth Duckworth. Even the Richard Shaw stuff was pretty abstracted, or Virginia Scotchie's is also loosely figurative. Some older Justin Novak's work. Trey Arnaz would do these large installations. Judy Onofrio would do figurative elements in her pieces. They were covered with beads and glued, a lot of stuff glued to the surface. If you can think about the figure as a starting point, or again, like Trey's work, think about the figure in the installation way, whether it's a whole room or just a huge area of a wall or the corner of a ceiling. You start thinking about the figure in placement differently. Marilyn Lysor playing with these different body types. She would do all of these women who were in war. Michael Lucero took a lot of freedom in the figure, using a variety of different material, as you see the baby stroller or the glass blown hat. But his surface work was always very painterly, and as you looked around the piece, the story was slowly unfolding. As you looked at the other side of the piece, you get more information. Michael Lucero did a lot of series called Pot Heads, and so loosely the one on the left is actually a figure and the head is a pot. Look into Michael Lucero's work more if you're interested. Monica Vandendoel does a lot of large-scale figurative work, and Nan Smith is really similar. Nan was teaching down in Florida, I think still teaches there, and Monica teaches in San Jose. So again, the figure's been used in a contemporary sense for a long time, and historically, so virtually forever, it's just been used. There's an early Beth Kavner. So the tile work and installation, like elements of the figure, here's ears. Richard Dawkins' work um, uses the figure quite extensively, and I would research more of his if you're interested. His work deals with a lot of social issues related to anti-war or proliferation of nuclear weapons or even nuclear power. And that large tile piece is all made up of skulls and dice and ears. Um, here's a tile piece I did back in 2001. And you can see the scale of it. And it's just made up of a bunch of different forms. Now, these are all slump molded forms. So we'll talk about that technique in the course too. One of my favorite funk artists who used the figure extensively was Robert Arneson. I love the way Rudy Audio would play with these forms and have these appendages sticking off, like he's putting his left hand on top of one of these kind of wing things that comes out. And then when he went to paint it, you could see how his ideas around the slip painting on there starts to unfold. Again, one of my favorite contemporary figured artists is this guy, Sergei Yusupov. And again, the scale, as I showed you his earlier work, his newer work, the scale is upped quite a bit. Here he is working on one, and I like the idea of the bottom of the piece is just as important as the top. And as you can see from the surface where he's painted these pieces, you can also see that he's really good with drawing, and so he does a lot of drawing. Here's a drawing that he's done, and here's some larger scale drawings. Chris Antman is another artist that I really love. Her work, she does these centerpieces. Here's one that was in the Portland Art Museum years ago. And the details on them are pretty exquisite. Thomas Bartel is another artist that I really enjoy. His work plays with your mind a little. Here's just the color of this one really takes off. Garrett Grimm's an artist to look at if you like to throw. All of her work is thrown, so this whole figure you see her working on is all thrown elements that have been put together. Christina Cordova, Matt Weddle, again looking at his for scale. Ideas around scale can be interpreted in a variety of ways, whether it's one piece or many pieces all in one. If you look at this, they're kind of framed into these steel bands. This is an Alan Rosenbaum. I'm going to go a little quicker through these. I love Wesley Andrich's work too. Lisa Craig. I'm going quicker through these because they're reiterating some of the other ones I've already shown, like Adrian Arlio's newer work here. And I think it's really important for you to find something within the context of this short lecture on the figure, because the figure is just extensively used in all media. And so in clay, I feel like there's quite a bit to be influenced by, and doing that research and finding whether you are really fascinated by Nan Smith's work or Patty Warshina's work, that's where you go. You try and find what you like. Here's a goofy thing. Thomas Erdel or Viola Fry, who made really large figurative pieces. Here she is in her studio with a whole bunch of pieces behind her. This is a really large figure here outside in California. There's some in a museum. You can tell that they're around 12 or 13 feet high. You can see where they're kind of put into sections. You can see lines where they've been stacked, especially on this guy where you see him, right, and his tie is cut off in two different places. Another artist that really is one of my favorite figurative artists, Tip Tolan. She has work in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. She happens to live in Gig Harbor. She has work all around the world and is one of the internationally known figurative artists in the clay world. Here's a Buddhist Buddha piece, all gold leafed, but it's clay. Tip Tolan's work tells a lot of stories, and again, researching her work and understanding the concepts behind each individual piece might give you some more knowledge into her work, of course. Oops. There she is working on one. You can even see she has a Ron Muke poster behind her. She's one of those people in that realm of amazing figurative work. Here's these finished. And she has a sister who, they're twins, so they look really similar. So this is kind of portrait. Here's more of Tip's work. I brought some students down to the Portland Art Museum, and she did this whole piece on all of these pieces were just amazing. Here's Robert Arneson in his studio to get a sense of some of his scale. Some of his pieces were smaller. He used himself as a model quite extensively, but he was incredibly political with his work. He talked anti-war quite a bit. This is General Nuke. This, I believe, is a congressman. And he really loved Jackson Pollock, so he did a couple portraits, and then actually one of his last pieces before he died was a tribute to Jackson Pollock too. So in my work, I do the figure quite a bit, but I kind of slacked off on it. Here's an older piece from a couple years ago. You just see in details of this one on its side, and then this is a different one. You can see how I'm building it with coils, big slab coils. And what I'd like to do a lot is like build it to a point, let it stiffen up and paddle it and smooth it, and wrap that edge for the next coil until I slowly close it in, start getting it to the point where I want it. But I'm working on the elements all the way, from the ears to the nose to the mouth. So that's, of course, just one way. I showed you Beth and Tip's work. So Beth Kavanagh and Tip Tolan work solid, and they cut it apart and then hollow it out and then put those pieces together. You need to make it a hollow piece because we need to fire it that way. If it's smaller, as the first models, where you're just doing these solid models, we can get them through the kiln. But other than that, if they're really large, we can't fire a solid piece. For one, it'll crack in the drying process, but in the firing process, it's next to impossible to fire it solid. So that idea around building it with coils, pinch pot, slabs, all these different elements that you know with skills that you'll slowly learn and get better at, that's a good approach. Building it solid and then cutting it apart is another good approach. So go through other techniques as we go, and I'll discuss that further in some videos. So what I want you to do now is to pick 3 or 4 out of here. Hopefully you took good enough notes. If not, you're going to have to go back and watch it again. take some notes and pick 3 or 4 that you're going to do some research on and get influenced by. There must be something in here that was influential to you. So, and we'll talk later. Okay, bye bye.